Yo, what's up, everybody? Welcome to my turtle hermit shell here. Not really that far off of being an official statement as to the state of my being and my room at this point. I felt like I wanted to address everybody today and sort of like talk about my feelings regarding current events again, since it seems like today has sort of marked what I think to be a moment in history with the release of Sora 2 from OpenAI. You can basically already see that since its release this morning, almost everybody's feeds have just blown up with much higher quality AI content. And before I sort of get into the philosophy or the legality of everything, firstly, I would just like to say, like, if you don't think that a lot of it's funny or sort of interesting, then you're basically just, being a Nazi. Because besides the fact of legality and copyright and whatever else, it's certainly funny and gives a lot of people an interesting tool to work with to sort of reimagine things. And it basically flows just like with anything else, Are things going to be ruined? I mean, that's about as much as trying to predict the trends of the market anyways as to what's going to be popular or not. You would think, though, that just as naturally as stories themselves come into being, that some sort of natural mechanism that allows whatever content to be created to sort of be filtered by the masses before it becomes something that proliferates everybody's ideas as to a thing. So it almost sort of self-authenticates itself in those regards. But speaking about art, I've totally sort of exploded myself, and I don't think that I would have ever done this in any previous sort of moment in my life, because I think that doing it all at once actually allows there to be like the fact that there's just a sheer huge amount of numbers of different things that sort of allows me to just kind of put everything in here. And once you kind of take it all in at once, sort of, I think creates a sense of competition. If nothing else, definitely a sense of time and how I've utilized mine. And if there's any talent to be had at all, then maybe I have a talent in being able to move on at least, with things so that I can produce so much. So yeah, that's why I kind of opened up and said that, welcome to my turtle shell here. And I sort of feel that it's appropriate, though, given sort of my experience in life and in this world, that I genuinely want to push back with my representation of things as much as the world seems to be pushing on me, And anybody who thinks that you don't have necessarily a direct effect on the world, I ask you to look into maybe physics as sort of the basis for your effect. I think any prominent scientist will vote in favor that ultimately you do affect the nature of reality. But I like to think that it's much more than just some minuscule moment, which is what a scientist will say, because I think that as soon as there is essentially a moment that represents you, then you basically have an eternity. It's the idea that you're an indisposable sort of thing. And then once you sort of exist in this place of eternity, then it's almost like you have complete control over reality. And I think that it sort of operates off of a balance where you're sort of defining yourself and what's important, obviously through decision making and choices. And as soon as you sort of do that, I think that what ultimately happens is you create a space, sort of a negative space, that is a shadow to all the choices that you have made. And once this sort of shadow kind of comes into being, your footprint, as it were, then I think that things are just as real, in as much as they are real in this world that we inhabit, because ultimately it's all the decisions and choices that you haven't made. And then so there is a residual place, which is sort of outside of that circle, that sphere, that sort of soul stone that you have created. And I think that ultimately, once you sort of reach every new idea, that basically determines the next sort of challenges or route that you're going to take in life, that this thing has the opportunity to change. And then so in that sense, I think that there is the self, which is the common self, and then there is the self, which is the immortal self. And the common self is the thing which makes the self itself nothing. It is like the ability that we all have to dream. Dreams can be things which seem to give us so much wonder and enchantment within our lives, but everybody seems to dream, and sort of thing. And it's the same way, I believe, with the soul, that the idea that perhaps maybe you can exist eternally in some way, based upon this micro moment, however small it may be. I think that in the eternities, everything becomes represented in an eternity itself. So there's your eternity, but then everything has an eternity, basically. And as soon as everything sort of has an eternity, then it's almost like you're back to square one. And everything's going to play out so that you can experience yourself, which ultimately means that you need to make choices, which then creates this plane from which all the choices of everything's spirit and soul ultimately create the experience that we have today. And it is by this sort of give and take of these celestial embodiments of ideas that I believe sort of time and space gives rise to itself. And we can have experience, and we can share things, and we can have a few things that perhaps nobody else does. But at that point in time, does it really matter if it's only you? And how can that necessarily be, again, when I say that it's only you? Well, certainly if you exist for a long enough period of time, then ultimately you're going to express a multitude of things which then sort of alludes to the idea that there's many things that make up you. And as much as you change, the things that you like change. And these things that you would say you are almost as much out of your control then as things that you would say are normally out of your control. And it's sort of this space in which we give things control and we take control. And I think taking control is, in this case, and under these circumstances and context, can sort of be transmuted into another sort of idea that we can have. I think control is just like that ability that you have to reach for something. And reaching for something, I think, itself doesn't necessarily denote some idea of control. But I think that it shows that you want. And I think that at the depth of all things, possibility and potential are at the core and the root of everything that exists. And I believe in the truth, and I believe in belief. I believe truth is something you don't have to believe in, but I believe that there's more than the truth, because ultimately the truth is just like the other side of what we say is nothing. We can't necessarily really describe nothing. And so it just goes, we can't necessarily really describe the truth as well. So I think that there's more than the truth, but I think belief is potential. And I think that in the moment that you believe in yourself and that you believe that you have potential, I think that what control really is then identifying that you have this place of eternity to go to believe that you can make decisions in this way and in, this manner. So that's sort of, my whole play on the idea of everything at play. The more that this sort of Wild West show sort of plays out and everybody doesn't necessarily know what to say, I urge everybody to try to do something like this. Go somewhere that you've set up that you feel like is basically you reduced. If the world seems like it doesn't make sense to you anymore, maybe it's not that the world doesn't make sense. Maybe sense always makes sense and people can always make sense of everything. But what I really mean when I say that maybe the world doesn't necessarily make sense to you anymore is that maybe it doesn't seem like the world is quite for you anymore. And I challenge everybody to sort of go and find themselves in a space where they can try to talk this out as much as they can as to where they think control really comes from and how all these energies from the beginning of time to the end of time sort of commingle. Try to express that. Try to say what you say. If you already believe in something, that's cool. Then reiterate it and try to work it into how what you already know deals with this current situation that the world is going through. And perhaps if enough people do this, then we can sort of navigate, this Earth ship in a much more, cooperative manner, so to speak. But I think getting to the point where once you feel like I've been talking continuously pretty well here, but I kind of want to take a little bit of time to sort of riddle out this equation before I sort of make mention of it, because everything's been said so well so far. And, I'm 14 minutes into this, and so it always makes for a better movie when things just seem to flow. But for a moment, I think there can be a little bit of silence. Because maybe there are a lot of things talking around me. And now I've sort of found my train of thought, and this is something that I've been thinking about all day long. I've been waiting to make this video, so I've already thought about everything. So I know I wanted to say this, and I finally just sort of came to the place where I've realized it now. Already said everything else that I wanted to say, but this is sort of something else that I wanted to say, and kind of why I feel like this actually works, you know, creating a space such as this, and you know, how ultimately you can sort of defend yourself up against whatever the world throws at you, by creating sort of a shell like this, you know, and just surrounding yourself with the way you express and see things. You know, what is art to you? What stands out? What makes you do a double take? What makes you think about something? Figure that out. What do you like? What don't you like? How do your hands communicate with what you see and everything else? Can you communicate with your hands? How well? Do you have to come up with other skills and talents to try to create a much better round out of everything? Rather than relying on sort of one section of a thing itself, you know, all of that. But ultimately, you know, when you get to the place where what are we and what are dreams and why is it that we do anything, I think it's important to realize that, you know, having myself gone all the way to basically study quantum physics, you know, and uncertainty principles and whatever else, and type stuff. Obviously, what you see is very important, I think. And ultimately, even in the beginning of engineering, they'll always tell you form follows function. You know, and especially at the microscopic level, right? The idea of basically what everything does is basically how it looks, its structure. And I think that ultimately, if you can find yourself in a place where you have defined yourself so much by these structures and what you think you're capable of, using these mechanisms that we've spoke of, right? This decision making, I think ultimately you can be comfortable with death at that point in time. Maybe what actually does get you, you know, and you can sort of say to anything that it's at this point you can protest. It's at this point you can not participate in what you don't want to do, and everybody tries to make sense of the world in some way, why it is that you have to do what you do. But this moment, I think, exists forever. Everyone's going to try to say and spin realities to you, and why it has to work this way for everything to work together, and things such as that. But ultimately, I like to say, like, why does anything do anything? And, you know, with what the world becomes being as malleable as a dream itself, for is it not all these dreams and all these things that ultimately lead to basically what we come up with and do anyways? And I think that once you can sort of see almost all the chaos, I think in that moment you can see something beyond the chaos, you know, something beyond truth, where truth is this idea that what I've come to realize is that there are two, and once there are two, there's always more. But beyond the truth, this whole thing basically never changes. It's this idea that there's so much change involved with everything that there's truth. That quick statement right there in that short little adjunct basically sums up the feeling. And it's an immediate thing that you better grab onto with whatever you can. That idea that there's so much change that there must be truth. And it's something beyond truth, and kind of referring to some of my other videos that I did a little bit ago. It's that idea that there's a good character, and this good character exists at every point in time, always. I think that it's by a skill that you can find this good character, and then ultimately be able to take yourself to places such as this that either you've created or that you utilize with other people to harness these sort of ideas. Rather say that than energies, but basically the same thing. That there is a good character. And the good character, I think, ultimately leads to more decisions, always. And that bad character is something that is very enticing, because I think that what its enticement is, at least to me, is this idea that you can basically have one ultimate sort of point, right? It's like you can know one thing and know it completely. And then at that point you can know everything. And so it tries to sort of beat everything into this one point. But just sort of through my practice of doing things like this, I like to think in more triplicates now. And this idea that this good character sort of points in many directions, kind of thing, and I can get a line, no matter what objects things are, but a line is just a span of time. I can line certain things up by how I calculate my angles and trajectories from that place where I feel that character. But ultimately, I think once you realize that the world does run and operate off of your ability to express yourself and your ability to surround yourself with things that basically encapsulate this expression. I think that you can believe. I think that you can believe that you'll be on the right track just by what you see and what you put in your path, before you exit this place, kind of thing. It's like a dream. It's like you can create your own little dream in here for a minute, because who wouldn't walk in here and think that things just seem so odd, but to you, it's just you. And that's how you'll always have something so unique as well. I don't think anybody really needs to worry about things becoming fake. Ultimately, I don't believe that, because I think that realistically, no matter how any of this really gets, nothing can do everything simultaneously at once. It's a problem that people have basically already solved, And if that's the case, you'll always have the opportunity to express yourself in your way. Now, how it is that you deal with the idea of competition and not being as good, and whatever else, but maybe you can be your own unique way, which is just different than the norm, but maybe everybody's different than the norm. And then maybe your little direction here or there is what actually creates value for you in your world. And maybe that's all really value is your ability to exercise these things in different ways. And I don't think anything can really have no value at all. I think the closer you get to no value, the more you just become observant and are an observation of stuff, which ultimately renders that nothing is genuinely suffering. If I had to say something about suffering myself, and trying to approach that issue. But I think that sort of, as an existing being working towards this end, I think allows you to believe that any interaction that you sort of come to that basically seems to be something which is negative, or in other words, seems to be something that just doesn't quite make sense, right? And doesn't quite make sense to you. It makes you feel like, you weren't born for this world, kind of thing, because it just doesn't seem to be working out for you, and it seems to be working out for everybody else. And, why am I not this? Why am I not that? Why don't I have this? Why don't I have that? Why wasn't I born with this or born with that? Whatever that is, I wish I could be different, kind of thing. I wish I could change things. I wish I could be smarter. I wish I could be better looking, or whatever, any kind of thing. And I sort of, I'm now going to reference my book here because my point is coming up where I'm going to try to flip some things. Is there such a thing as real popularity? Speaking about these people that are popular, that you recognize as popular. Is popularity not broad? Is government popular? If the writer's book only has a government because governments are popular, does it make it a premonition for it to have a government? That something good would ever rest on chance? What makes the question a question of free will? Either that or of the harsh nature of reality that takes innocence. And I think that there's multiple things to be concluded from that sort of statement, and it's that, maybe you should take hope from these things that you see that seem to be such icons in the world. And maybe that should again be to you that idea that amongst all this chaos, there is truth. And there are plenty of these things to grab onto. And that is sort of the one direction. And the other direction is sort of being more of a realist and not saying that anything is fated, but saying that everything is natural. Everything just follows in natural order, and everything's sort of out of everything's control, right? And then knowing anything good is sad, because ultimately you know that you're going to lose it. Ultimately you know you're going to lose whatever you feel is good, or the idea that something that is genuinely good and innocent has the chance to not make it. And that's sort of the causality of the natural world, and this idea that there are plenty of things that don't ever make it, that are innocent, and it is really sad. And I think that it's up to us to sort of know when and when not to um, make comparisons for things, because maybe the reality is we do lose things, and I'll show you why here in a second, and how that can work out in both ways, and how we do and how we don't. Because, like I said before, everything sort of has its own soul, which ultimately means that, you know, as we're making those decisions and whatever else, that ultimately somewhere something is on its own, and I think you need to believe in it. And that's where belief and truth can kind of go their separate ways a little bit, because um, maybe something else does have that moment and that capacity to um, be true itself. And I think that when that happens, it sort of becomes its own thing. And in that way, then good things can be lost. But again, you know, we have that whole idea of everything being eternal as well. And so, you know, I think that ultimately it's just a matter of time, really. But being able to recognize the room that you're in is certainly just like being able to recognize the time. And maybe the more that you believe in all this stuff, the more that you actually just treat everything without being the one room you want it to be. You treat things as what they are, right? And maybe there's some fidelity with that in certain ways. And, you know, I've been sort of pushed quite a bit, and which has basically led me to this, you know, sort of ideation of all this stuff. You know, and it's hard to remember all of this and to say it all in a way that sort of makes sense, and especially related to the idea that something is coming about that is out of control, you know. But I think that just talking about everything to an extent that allows us to realize that, you know, there's a lot going on always. And, you know, we're beings that are certainly capable of coming about through great mysteries and all these sorts of things that, you know, I don't think that it's too hard to say that, you know, we shouldn't count ourselves out quite yet. Especially if you're willing to do just a few or maybe one of these types of things that I've outlined, you know. But I think that authority is something really hard to believe in, and I think that ultimately that's what a lot of this kind of quenches itself down to, is, you know, just this idea of authority and its popularity, the ultimate authority. Surely, you know, more than just the legality of these things, there's definitely other uses for this stuff. This is literally just the one thing that is easiest for people to do, and what people get the most joy out of, you know, short time kind of whatever, dealing with this type of information and whatnot. You know, but everybody has their own light, and I think maybe the more you can figure that out, the more you do have that value, like I just said a little bit ago. But you know, barring just saying like go and do whatever you want, like if I really am being a considerate character, then I got to consider things much more than just, you know, saying something like that. I have to be able to say things in a very detailed way. You know, some things you can sort of like get the gist of, you know, just like my idea of creating those bodies, those celestial bodies of ideas that navigate off of choice, and which creates, you know, this this idea, that this feeling that there's these different planes, and as you're doing these things, it allows things to interact in their soul plane and, you know, in sort of this negative space of a plane as well, which ultimately is sort of like everybody's negative space, you know, which then ultimately just means that your soul plane is, you know, in that negative space as somebody else's negative space, and it's just sort of how it all works out. But, you know, I think that I know what I could just say, which I know is good, which is just that if you really do feel like this world is just not for you, and it's definitely not working out in any way or shape or form that you've ever imagined, like, realistically, the future, who knows what it will be? Like, seriously, who, especially even with this just coming out, like, who knows what the future will be like? Don't ever say, like, you know, as they say, don't count your chickens before they hatch, kind of thing. And they say that in a way where you don't prepare too much for something that's not going to be there or whatever. But for the other way too, a lot more could hatch than you are expecting as well. Like, a lot more stuff could happen. You don't know what the future is going to be like. It could be great and amazing, and all you do is just have to get there. Maybe it is all just a matter of time that all this stuff happens, and that the world actually does reach a place where it can be harmonious, or it's harmonious for you at some certain age, where maybe just something in you changes, just like puberty or whatever else, and you're able to, you know, not getting into too much pseudoscience of basically seeing things completely different or whatever else. As much as my whole sort of conversation I've just had isn't necessarily based off of one liberty to another liberty, right? I think that you know, maybe there will be some things that you are okay dying for. You know, like maybe you do build up enough confidence in certain ways that, you know, you do genuinely feel like, even if nobody agrees with me and whatever else, I'm going to hold this position. And I'm not going to submit myself to what everyone else is telling me I have to do. Maybe there are some things that like that you will genuinely figure out what it is that you stand for in your life. Maybe there's other processes that will have to happen where it's like, you know what, maybe you need to get some help from somewhere in some way. And then maybe that's just the opportunity that you have to try to describe all this stuff again, as basically you're put into a zero space, like a stem cell trying to recreate itself into an organism in a body, kind of thing. You know, I've certainly had to go through that process a few times, you know, kind of whatever. And maybe that's what you'll have to do. But I think you genuinely can build up enough confidence if you do focus on these things. Focus on your words, focus on creating things that bring you joy, that allow you to express yourself in a way that makes you feel like you have something special that nobody else has, and that you have a direction and a light, you know, given this idea that if anything's true, that there's always room for you. You know, I think genuinely you have the ability to create your own persona and all of these things just by sheer work and sheer effort, you know. And maybe I should just sort of finalize on confidence a little bit here. Read what I wrote. Today I can see a dramatic shift in the media as there was a new AI engine launched by OpenAI. It is called Sora 2 and just about seamlessly creates media indistinguishable from what I am going to say are lengthier processes. I don't just say human creation because I think the point in time when supplemental methods were being used to basically create universally spread ideas goes back to, let's say, printing presses and, what's the thing that they use? Interchangeable tools or whatever types of ideas across America. That spread itself, that when spread was itself more concerned to people than the process itself, which I'm sure was seen in many lights. And that's another thing to bring up too, is that a lot of these processes aren't necessarily going to die. I'm sure people, it's always just like, it's like buying something that says like handmade here. People still buy it. It's like people going, still riding horses. It's like there being that places that people might just go drive cars to if all the cars become automatically driven. Don't think that just like what was becomes like completely disappeared or whatever. Like if it genuinely gave an experience, it probably will be held somewhere, for you to enjoy or for other people to do and maybe compete at in their own thing, but just because, and it's like, but that shouldn't be the thing that limits us from things that are basically a huge part of our life being simplified and minimalized down into ways which allow us to understand and experience this human experience better, just because we feel that, it's something we like to do or whatever, that shouldn't be the limiting factor as to whether or not we improve upon it, kind of thing. That will always be there, especially if it really is something that people like to do. You got to have faith in that and trust that. That being, in regards to this new technique of creating media today, it has literally, in a comparison I will use, learn to walk. Anyways, the thing itself is indefinitely becoming more and more of what I will call purposeful application, as its quality is on standards with professionals at certain trades. I have already made multiple videos on the topic, but my relative position lies in the fact that I already exist in a space that was not requiring basic competition, which basically means I have been having to create worth that is individualized anyways. So I find it hard to believe I could be individualized more. And I'm just sort of saying, like, realistically, yeah, like I do have conditions for my living situation, but I would like to believe that it's like a lot of the stuff that I do and create these very elaborate designs, some of them are very intricate, you know what I mean? Some of them are like me trying to force something as quick as possible. I do like to believe that, I can see something and move in that direction based upon how I've sort of stabilized the moment of something, through art and through these other ways that I arrange things. But ultimately, I think maybe one way you can sort of build up confidence is just learning about the ideas of change and what it is that you're being asked to do. Obviously comes into play, and I want to sort of again give some ultimatum, but it's like obviously how much you're changing is something that is considered with what you're being asked to do, kind of thing. And so maybe it's just not beneficial to say, do whatever you want all the time or whatever, because maybe you're following something that you genuinely want. You just can't see that that's what gets you there, is that process of change. And this one might be something that I got to think about for just a little bit before I sort of, get back to finishing up this video here. It's been a decent one, but I mean, I feel like I needed to make it, especially because all that sort of happened today. I had the thought in the moment of it, like, quite a few times, you know, during the day, where I was just like, yeah, that's completely gives you liberty, you know? Just, I gotta remember to say that, because that's exactly what gives you liberty. And maybe it's for me more than anything, you know, because maybe I've already said everything that is for everything that I recognize at this point. You know, maybe I'm missing something inside me. Some word, some phrase. And I definitely want to use if, ands, or buts with this one. There are obviously real world situations where self defense is involved, but I think creating these hypothetical situations can sort of help you to perhaps avoid the real world situations, you know, sort of psychologically get in your mind and reiterate these things. And then when the conversation becomes silent and you are navigating your world, this stuff is a booming voice inside of you that directs you in certain ways. You know, because obviously there are certain amounts of whatever you're justified to do based upon the situation that you're in, you know, but something that's just in support of perhaps all of this stuff actually is probably more of where the moment is being taken, you know. And there's certainly a light moment to it. You know, I could say something like, if somebody says that this stuff doesn't do anything, like not one thing at all, like that's completely bogus, right? That statement that they made, I can confidently say, like, that's completely bogus. Like, you're telling me it doesn't affect me in any way at all, by sort of creating this shell here. Like, that's completely, like, you can definitely know to disagree with that, you know. Now, once you recognize that the conversation is about that, then maybe it's about, you know, which one is your favorite one, and what do you think each of them does for you in terms of what it is and how it makes you feel, um, and why you think it would cause you to move in some more general way about something. Um, you know, is it just by the fact that you're looking at something for a certain amount of time, and then in some way, um, you think that everything will sort of line up in composure of the elements of things based upon, you know, just the general idea that you're getting from something. But come on, like there's no way that this does nothing for somebody's psyche, which affects a lot of things. Maybe it doesn't affect anything of control. Maybe it doesn't allow any control at all. It just certainly affects somebody. Maybe it doesn't necessarily change the outcome of whether or not they fulfill something great or lesser. But I'll still tell you what you're wrong about if you were to say something. You'd be wrong to say that it doesn't make you feel a certain way if you look at something long enough. that it would make you feel a certain way about something. That this stuff genuinely does make you feel a certain way, whatever it is. You'd be lying, I think. Sure, there are amounts of that to be taken into consideration with amounts of salt, right? But I think that you'd definitely be hard cap to say that looking at some of this stuff doesn't create a moment for some things, some feelings, some thoughts. You know, and thoughts are such a wild thing too. You know, just the idea of being able to create something that all of a sudden gives you an advantage of it over everything. Is the simple thought the best, or an advanced and complicated one? You know, there's a few things that you could sort of say about this, and you know, maybe if it did lead you somewhere, you could say like, oh, I initially just believed in myself, and ultimately, if anybody makes it to a good place, that's definitely gonna, you know, be something that could definitely be a part of why they got there. I want something a little more concrete though. You know, like you know, there's more hypotheticals that seem just like I could just say these pretty confidently. If the world ever gets to a point where circles are illegal to draw, then you know things have gone too far in some direction, right? There's another real general one for you that should give you a certain amount of confidence to know that you're not necessarily wrong. If the world got to the point where it was illegal to draw circles, you'd certainly know something was up, for sure, in that situation. Completely. And now I want to use a little bit of magic. See if I can. With the time that I have left. Same thing with lines. If it ever becomes illegal to draw a line, you know something's up. You know you can take some liberties and sneak around, basically. Feel like I'm in action of sealing my room, kind of, you know, like dedicating it somehow. I've just got to come up with the right spell. Maybe what could do it, which I think leaves enough up to chance that maybe perhaps it doesn't ever have to be like that. Things can change. Leave yourself an out before it even begins with your statement about an out. But maybe what could really be an attitude that could be spread through all these things. If somebody doesn't tell you that you live forever, you should be wary of that person, because they might take things a little too seriously. Just remember that. If somebody tells you that you can't live forever, which is about as much of a decision as something can make, I feel like, in this world. And leaving up enough chance, because it's as much a personal experience as it is like a universal idea, just like the idea of death itself. You feel like the whole world's against you and people are berating you with questions and all these other things. If anyone's coming up to you doing this stuff physically and you have a chance to talk to them and say, do you believe that you live forever? And they say no. Then maybe you could say something like, either trying to prove it to them, a law of thermodynamics that says nothing is either created nor destroyed, it's only transformed. If you wanted to try to convert them, you could say that. Or you could say something like, then we'll just have to see what happens, because the world is unpredictable and you can really test all your theories out about whether or not any of this works and find out. And going down differing roads from that scenario itself up to the point in which there are physical altercations and problems involved. So much so that you feel like you have nowhere to go. And this is just me from having been to those places. If they tell you that you can't believe in God, then you should probably stay as calm as possible and try to work with as many people as you can until you find people that do have some beliefs in things. And then work on getting your way back to square one or even ground. I feel like that's a smart way to look at it. And it should be real too, you know? And going more down the road of testing something out, right? We'll see if what I believe is true, that, you know, this stuff really does affect your mood, affect your general direction in life. just as much as molecules arranged in certain geometries create the actual elements that we see and use. Then maybe I could say something like, it always helps to be fit. Whatever age you are, it always helps to stay as healthy as you can be, because that will put you a leg up over most all people, on this entire planet. Just stay healthy and stay fit, stay active. Because if it really is a test, then you better be well-rounded, so that when your chickens do hatch, if it's not enough, that you have something else to go to if you're being tested. And that is a real general way to look at life itself. If you think you're being tested about anything, you think this is a test, be well-rounded. And again, if anybody tells you it's illegal to draw a circle, there's certainly some liberties that you should seek out, or try to defect in some way or another from your situation or the people. So then how much do you believe in yourself? You should also probably be very wary of anybody that would ever tell you not to believe in yourself, which assumes quite many of these things. So basically, don't ever believe anybody that says you can't believe in yourself. That's nonsense. That's ridiculous. I'm not necessarily going to tell you what I think you should fight or die for. In all honesty, I think that any sort of fighting that's not necessarily like this, you are being stupid, in my opinion. And then in any case or scenario you come across peoples, then you run through this whole process that we've just basically stated, which, then you can find out what's real or not. And you really can go, and if you have to go and do some things, then you really can find out what's real or not. But again, whoever you're working with, find out this stuff, and again, try to be well-rounded. What do we really need anyways? If we have to leave, maybe that's better than engaging. What do we really need anyways? What is all this? Maybe I need to keep my needs and wants in check. Then as much as this stuff has infinite value, it's something that I can walk away from. Saying something like, at least I'm alive. Is there really any sort of cause worth dying for? Maybe before I get to the idea of is there anything worth dying for, I'll say something like, that other road that we sort of forked at, where what if they do believe in God and immortality? Then you could say, well, why don't we just do what we need then? That's should be your immediate next kind of question. Like, why do we need to do more than we need if they believe that you live forever? And then whatever reasons are for that, obviously will then come up to the point of competition. Competition is a reason. Now, there are many back-asswards ways to try to dibble around competition, but Just like I said the other day, I think openly admitting something is probably the best way to deal with competition. Probably openly admitting defeat, which may be needing to recognize somebody in your life. And if it really is your time to go, then you can say, but before we get there, has any of this been fun? Is any of this worth doing again? And I think you should question things. You should question your world more. This is just a general thing. If life doesn't seem like it's genuinely fun at times, and a lot of the time, I think you have a right to question your world and question the nature of things. I think being something that is a living thing that basically has no joy at all at any time, I think you have a right to question the nature of the world even at that point. I think you genuinely do. I think you almost have nothing to lose. Maybe that's something that you can fight and die for. After all this has been said and done, that kind of reaches a spike, there where and maybe I could reiterate some of my other things where it's like, life is a feeling. It's genuinely what it is. You can try and classify it in all these other experiences, but on top of everything, it's a feeling. And I think you should be very wary of anything that tells you that you can't have feelings. Any process which tries to create superiority complexes through things that have no feelings, I think you should be very wary of. I don't think it's a problem to recognize people. And at times I do think it is okay to reduce what everybody does to something as trivial as a dream. For the sake of all of this and for everyone. Then what really is the most complicated thing? Then at that point, maybe you could say that you are, because you have zero ideas about any of this stuff and how you fit into the world. Sounds pretty complicated to me. So maybe you should really try to start believing in yourself somehow. And to an extent, I think joy is worth dying for. I think subjugation and subjection are terrible things. And I've done my best to create some idea, maybe through some mental gymnastics, where all of this stuff can sort of, give you the ability to be comfortable and confident enough and elaborate enough and to leave, cut some things out that are just unnecessary and whatever else. And there's some real examples there, some hypotheticals. Try to keep things, at an even mood through the entirety. Maybe a generality is a good way to sort of finish this. If something tells you that life on the whole isn't good and isn't a pleasurable experience, then you should be very wary about them. And if you don't feel like you're climbing up a hill at all times, you might be doing something wrong. Me being a wrestler, having all these Greek and Roman books around me, I think struggling itself is the most humble fight somebody can actually entertain, where it's all about a type of control, which even in the exercise of the sport itself exhibits a type of control to not let the exercise of the struggle become something that isn't simply merely a struggle for control. In that way, I call myself a real expert. I kind of want to be careful about just being happy. I think that there's a broad range of emotions that can be experienced, and some of them are pretty mild and mute and indifferent and odd. Maybe watch out for somebody that says there's only one emotion. Which I think ultimately a lot of this is characterizing that spirit well, giving these sort of hypothetical situations that could be real based upon your interactions with somebody or something. You know, though, again, maybe if something is telling you that you have no place to live, you should be wary and not believe it. If something seems to be doing an injustice towards you, or life in general does, I think that you should search for greater liberties, and maybe you should be wary about it. I don't necessarily think it's wrong to not do anything that people ask you to do. Or I think I'm not necessarily in favor of somebody that doesn't do anything that anyone asks them to do, but I certainly believe that there are amounts of doings which, could become wrong in a sense. Varying levels of doings that you're asked to do. And I think time is perhaps the most important thing to think about when you're being asked to do anything. Do you have enough your time? And I think that if anything that you're being asked to do essentially is destroying your time, then I think that you have some more liberties to search out and seek of. And now, again, death is in closing here. What would you fight to the death over? What would you go to the city about? What would you plea and protest over? Maybe at this moment, the best way to probably close this off or seal it up is to say that maybe I'm willing to die over competition. I didn't say a competition, over competition, unless we're talking about the experience of life being a competition itself, which could then be a competition. And I say that because the word is almost a generalized thing in its own way, which then almost allows there to be consideration for all these things if competition is to be taken seriously. Maybe I could say it like this. Am I willing to die for the person that I am now? Does that hold up enough against air? And as much as uncontrollable as the world is, the funny thing is that hypotheticals might be the most pure statements that we can make. And it might sound funny to say, could I die for myself to be who I am now? But maybe it insinuates that I could be something else. And maybe me being competitive considers all of this. The question assumes that I could be something else. I have a choice to be this or something else. So would I die for this? Which ultimately relates back to the question of, do I think that this has been a pleasurable experience? Yes. Which I believe answers both questions with consideration. Which then maybe there really need be no more greater stipulation of death than somebody being able to reiterate something along those lines and then propose the question up to themselves again. As an emotion that compares to the idea of fighting for yourself. With it being as real to the emotion as possible. But also keeping the fight itself within your control. That it's still even a struggle to say. And creates an assumption as well, if it may. You're welcome to follow the outline. You're welcome to change all the answers up, change the questions up, try to do something as long, try to do something as short, try to do something longer, do nothing, do everything, in between, on your head, under your bed, on your TV. maybe with somebody. Now this is just like a sleepover. Just staying up late, talking about nonsense. Sleepover with all my past selves. Now, does any of this give you power? Maybe it can make you believe in power, like you believe in luck. I think it would be stupid for somebody to say that a number of these things has no value, or for somebody to say that there is no value in any of these things or a number of them. But how much power does it give you? Which again is maybe more of a question of what you believe in. What is luck? But a chance. Having a chance is like having a choice. Initially, my initial response is it makes me feel really bright, extremely bright, blindingly bright. I almost want to say something with indifference. But maybe again, if something tells you that not everything is alive, they might be quite different than you. At least me. Meaning that everything has a play. And if the competition is so hard, that it seems like you can't compete, given everything that competition details, maybe you have quite a few liberties to take in regards to doing something that nobody else is doing. And maybe that's always an out for competition. It creates opportunity instead of takes it away. And maybe feeling immortal is just like what I've said before. It's like feeling fear. And when you know that you're real, maybe you should always take it as an opportunity to work on your character. Which doesn't necessarily insinuate that something is immortal or not, but it certainly should help in either way. Because working on your character How this guy does this, he steps through reason until you connect with the thoughts and imaginations of a character, where given the character, you can imagine it. This character, though I think it's like ego, listening to reason, the only character the ego would want is perfect. Listening to reason, the only character the ego would want is perfect. Reason isn't perfect though, so when a character is created who is perfect, reason of such a character only explains his capabilities if he has an ego. It is that the perfect character, if explained, is less and less so, given that the perfect character then has no reason if he has no ego. It is when the idea of perfect is introduced to a character that they then lose character to ego and reason, as the perfect character is capable of anything. This is when too many coincidences occur for most any character, what makes a perfect character see ego and reason easily. What makes our language introduce the idea of how perfect a character as synonymous as seeing time's end. What is more appropriately the death of a character. Now, whether or not I've said anything good is all, again, up to the idea of whether or not I can remember any of this or act on any of it, or attune my general awareness to proceed forth in any manner as to what was said. Then maybe I could end with something like, if somebody tells you that the perfect character doesn't exist, then you should tell them they're wrong. And then if somebody tells you it's Jesus, then you can say, how this guy does this, he steps through reason until you connect with the thoughts and imaginations of a character, where given the character, you can imagine it. This character, though, I think it's like ego. Listening to reason, the only character the ego would want is perfect. Reason isn't perfect though, so when a character is created who is perfect, reason of such a character only explains his capabilities if he has an ego. It is that the perfect character, if explained, is less and less so, given that the perfect character then has no reason if he has no ego. It is when the idea of perfect is introduced to a character that they then lose character to ego and reason, as the perfect character is capable of anything. This is when too many coincidences occur. For most any character, what makes a perfect character see ego and reason easily, what makes our language introduce the idea of how perfect a character as synonymous as seeing time's end. What is more appropriately the death of a character? then they can say, I don't understand what you're talking about. And you can say something like, well, at least it's been said.